Mary Slessor, Chapter 2. It was up to her. 11-year-old Mary Slessor stood by the door of the only house she'd ever known and watched as a neighbor hauled away the kitchen table. The table was being sold to raise money for the family to move to the city of Dundee, Scotland. "Don't worry about the move, Mary. Things will work out for the best. It will give your father a fresh start," her mother said, patting Mary's bright red curly hair. "There will be new opportunities for you in Dundee. Perhaps you'll even be able to go to school." Mary's eyes lit up. "That would be wonderful. Do you really think I might get to go?" she asked. "Once we're all settled in and your father has a steady job, I don't see why not. Now run along and fold the blankets for me, would you? I've a mind to put them in the bottom of this chest." Mary skipped happily from the front door of the cottage to the tiny bedroom she shared with her 3 younger sisters. Her younger brother John slept in the loft above the kitchen. Until a year ago, when he had become weak and died, Robert, her older brother, had slept in the loft as well. With his death, Mary had become the oldest child of Robert and Mary Slessor, after whom the 2 elder children were named. As Mary folded the blankets, she thought about what her mother had said and wondered whether things really would be better in Dundee than they were in Glucomston, near Aberdeen, on the northeast coast of Scotland, where they lived. Although Mary had never been more than a few miles from her home, her friend Helen had told her all about the towns in the lowlands of Scotland. The buildings there were apparently dark and close together, and it was almost impossible to breathe because the thick smoke produced by the factories hung in black clouds above the cities. It sounded horrible to Mary, and not one bit as good as living in Aberdeen, where the wind rustled through the Highland heather and down into the city. But surely things in Dundee weren't as bad as Helen said. Otherwise, why would her mother be so eager for the family to move there? Mary knew part of the answer. It was because of her father, a strong, muscular man with curly red hair, who told the most exciting stories and whose laugh could fill the whole house. That is, when he was sober. When he was drunk, he turned into a monster. He yelled and screamed and lashed out at his wife and children. And lately he had been drunk more and more. Mary knew it had something to do with his shoemaking business not going well. She had lain awake one night and had heard her mother beg her father to move the family to Dundee, where he could get a steady job in one of the new factories there. Mrs. Slessor had explained to Mary on several occasions that in this age of machines, the big money was to be made in the cities, working in the new factories springing up there, and not in some backwater community making shoes by hand. It was 1859, and anyone living in Scotland, she insisted, should be taking advantage of the wave of industrialization sweeping across the country. Mary desperately wanted to believe that moving to Dundee would be a change for the better. She hoped her father would stop drinking and get a job with a regular wage. She also hoped she could attend school. She longed to be able to read and write. As she finished folding the blankets, Mary heard a commotion outside the cottage and the neighing of a horse. She rushed outside to see the horse and dray that would take them to the ferry boat for the trip down the coast to Dundee. 2 days later, Mary discovered that Dundee was everything Helen had said, and worse. The family was crammed into a dirty 2-room apartment on the 2nd floor of a tenement building on Queen Street, right in the heart of one of Dundee's slums. And just as Helen had said, the air was so thick with black smoke that it coated the laundry. Mrs. Slessor hung out the window to dry. The laundry was often grimier after it had been washed than before. Mary helped her mother scrub and clean up the 2 rooms, but there were 2 things they could do nothing about. The first was the rats that scurried across the floor of the apartment. It was useless trying to catch them. Ew. Hundreds more were living out in the muddy streets, ready to move inside and take the place of any rat Mary and her mother managed to kill. The second thing they could do nothing about was the smell, which wafted up through the building from the street below. A mixture of raw sewage, and rotting garbage. On warm days, The terrible smell was so overpowering that Mrs. Slessor would keep the windows shut. It was better to endure the heat than open the windows and put up with the foul odor. Although the family's housing situation was horrible, Mary told herself it didn't matter as long as her father had a job and her mother was happy. And for the first month, that's exactly how things were. Mrs. Slessor busied herself arranging the apartment and taking care of the children while her husband began working for a shoemaker. It was such a relief to Mary to have her father come home at night not smelling of alcohol. Mary was especially delighted when her father began talking about moving the family into a cottage and sending the older children to school. They would do it as soon as he had saved up the money, her father assured everyone. Regrettably, this change in Mary's father lasted only about a month. One Saturday afternoon, about 5 weeks after they had moved to Dundee, Robert Slessor came home very late and very drunk. Mrs. Slessor had left his dinner mutton stew and mashed potatoes on the table for him. Soon after he arrived home, Mary heard her father throw the plate of food against the wall, cursing because it was as cold as a stone. Tears filled Mary's eyes as she lay still in bed between her sisters. Her stomach ached with hunger as she thought about the biggest chunks of meat that her mother had carefully set aside for her father's plate. Now the food was a splattered mess on the wall, a mess Mary would no doubt have to clean up in the morning. The shouting went on for a long time, but finally it died down and Mary fell asleep. In the morning she awoke to the sound of her father snoring loudly in the next room. The events of the night before drifted into her mind, and she was glad it was Sunday. At least today she would get to go to church with her mother, brother, and sisters. Mary liked attending Wishart Memorial Church, especially Sunday school. She enjoyed the stories the pastor told and the missionary reports of the church secretary, who would describe what was happening in Calabar. Mary knew all about Calabar from the missionary stories her mother read to the children from the missionary record, the missions newsletter of the United Presbyterian Church of Scotland. Calabar was an area in West Africa where in 1846, just 2 years before Mary was born, the Presbyterian Church had founded a mission. Mary could even find it on the map, right at the place where the coast of Africa took a sharp bend to the west. To Mary Slessor, sitting straight and tall in a dark wooden pew Sunday after Sunday, Calabar was everything Dundee was not. It was fascinating and foreign. Mary's big brother Robert had thought so too, and Mary recalled how together as little children, back in Gilcomston, they had played church together. Robert had always told her, "When I grow up, Mary, I am going to be a missionary. And do you know what? I'm going to take you with me." Mary had always laughed and replied, "That's a fine plan, Robert, and I'd be glad to be your assistant." Now Robert was dead, but Mary knew that her mother cherished hopes that John would become the missionary of the family. Mary did all she could to fire him with enthusiasm for Calabar. One Sunday afternoon, as they walked home from church, Mrs. Slessor and Mary fell in step together. The younger children walked on ahead, jumping over the cracks in the sidewalk. Mrs. Slessor spoke quietly. "Mary, I need to talk to you alone. Let's take the children home and get them something to eat, and then we'll go out walking for a bit. Your father should be awake by now. He can watch the children." Mary pulled her shawl around her shoulders and tried to imagine what her mother wanted to talk to her about. Her mother sounded so serious, as if she were talking to another adult. Back at the apartment, Mary held her breath as she waited for her mother to ask her father to watch the children. Her father begrudgingly grunted his agreement, and Mary and her mother slipped outside into the damp afternoon. As they left the building and began walking up Queen Street, Mrs. Slessor began to speak. Her voice was soft, and her eyes were fixed on the cobblestones. "Mary," she began, "I had such high hopes for us all moving to Dundee. Your father promised me he would stop drinking and get a proper job, but," she sighed deeply, "after last night, it's just not going to happen. He told me he was fired for being rude to the foreman, and I don't think he'll ever hold down a job. Alcohol has got him good and proper." Mary reached for her mother's hand and held it as they kept walking. I've been talking to Mrs. Clooney in the next apartment, Mrs. Slessor went on. She works in the Baxter cotton mill and says they are hiring women. I'm a good weaver. I'm going to apply for a job tomorrow. I need you to stay home and look after the others. Her voice trailed off as she stopped to look her 11-year-old daughter fully in the face. Oh, Mary, Mary lass, I never meant for it to be this way, she sobbed quietly. I wanted you to go to school and learn. You have a quick mind, and it breaks my heart to see it wasted. It's all right, Ma. We'll find a way to cope. I'll go to school one day. It won't be late, Mary said gently, feeling older than her 11 years. It's all right, honest. Mrs. Slessor blew her nose and bent down to kiss her daughter on the cheek. Whatever else goes wrong, she said, I will always thank God for giving me a daughter like you, Mary. A lot more did go wrong in the next few months. Within a few weeks of each other, Mary's two youngest sisters caught diphtheria and died. Secretly, Mary blamed her father for their deaths. If he had been able to keep a job, they would be living in a cottage on the outskirts of town by now instead of being stuck in the middle of Dundee, where the air was foul and the sun never shone between the towering gray buildings. Despite the death of her sisters, Mary enjoyed being a little mother to the family. The wake-up bell from the mill clanged at 5 o'clock each morning, and Mary would get up with her mother so they could have a drink of tea together before she left for work. Sometimes her father joined them, but more often than not, he was sleeping off a night of heavy drinking. Things went on this way for about 6 months, until one day in early 1860, when Mary awoke early to hear her mother sobbing quietly into her pillow. Mary crept out into the living room where her parents slept and found her mother in bed alone. She sat down gently on the edge of the bed. What's wrong? She quietly asked her mother. Mrs. Slessor rolled over to look at her daughter and stifled a sob. I don't have the money for the rent, she said, and I don't know what to do. Your father found the money I put away under the flour jar for the rent. He spent it all on alcohol. Not that it would have mattered anyway. We would have come to this in the end. The money I make is not enough to keep us all, and your father can't pass a pub without going in and getting drunk. She put her hands over her face. Oh, Mary, Mary, what are we to do? She sobbed. Mary's heart sank. She could see it all very clearly. Her father was away at a pub drunk, and her big brother was dead. It was up to her and her mother to keep the rest of the family together. I'll get a job, Mary replied. I won't be able to earn as much as you, but if we put our money together, we should be able to scrape by, don't you think? Mrs. Slessor reached out and hugged her daughter. Mary, I'll make it up to you somehow. You'll see. Here you must be cold. Come and lie down with me. Your father will just have to stay with the younger children and do his drinking after we get home. Mary climbed under the thin blanket with her mother. There is one good thing, her mother said softly. What's that? Asked Mary wearily. The mill has just opened a school for the younger workers. Since you're only 11, they will employ you in the mornings and let you go to school in the afternoon. And then the reverse the next day. Mary lay in bed, suddenly wide awake. A school! She was going to school. Oh, Ma, she said, reaching out to hug her mother. I can stand anything if only I learn to read. Mary's mother hugged her tightly, and eventually the two of them drifted off to sleep. The following day, Mrs. Slessor filled 2 lunch pails, and mother and daughter set off for work together before sunup. At the mill gate, Mrs. Slessor stopped to talk to another woman, who Mary assumed was some type of supervisor. Mary was right. A minute or two later, her mother beckoned to her. Mary, she said, turning to her daughter, this is Mrs. Dugan. Go with her, and she will show you what to do. You will be working this morning, and this afternoon her daughter will take you over to the classroom. Mrs. Dugan smiled a toothless smile at Mary and beckoned her to follow. They entered a door at the far end of the huge brick building, and a man handed Mary a card with numbers on it. The card was to be used to keep track of the hours she worked. Thank you, said Mary. The man grunted and then said, Let's see if you're still thanking me when you come out tonight, lassie. He laughed coarsely. The noise inside the building was deafening. The clanging and banging of machinery echoed inside the largest room Mary had ever seen. Mrs. Dugan pointed to a cubbyhole where Mary could put her lunch pail. "Leave your shawl and cardigan there, too, lass. It's hot work in here. I'm sure you've been told that already." Together, Mary and Mrs. Dugan walked over to one of the large machines in the room. "Now I'm only going to explain this to you once," said Mrs. Dugan, "so you'd better listen carefully. You have to be quick to be a piecer. Looks like you're built for it, being so slender." Mary wiped her brow and tried to concentrate on what the woman was saying. Her head was already swimming. It was so hot in the room. Mary's mother had warned her that the mill owners liked to keep the inside of the mill between 80 and 90 degrees Fahrenheit because they believed it made the quality of the cotton fabric they produced finer. But it was hotter than anything Mary had ever experienced before. Mary took a deep breath. It was going to be hard to work in such heat for hours. Already she found herself longing for lunchtime, when her mother had told her she would be allowed to sit on a bench outside. The job of a piecer was simple enough to explain. It took Mrs. Dugan less than 5 minutes. Basically, Mary had to walk or crawl back and between the reels of the spinning machine, tying together the threads on the spinning frames when they broke. The quality of the fabric produced depended on strong threads. The job, however, was much more difficult to perform than it sounded, most of the time. Mary had to run from one broken thread to another. If she didn't go fast enough, the person operating the machines would clip Mary across the back of the head with her hand. Other times, Mary had to crawl under the machines to reach the bottom threads, coming perilously close to the pulsating machinery. Within an hour or two, she was exhausted and not at all surprised to learn from one of the older girls that a piecer often walked or crawled 20 miles in a day between the spinning machines. When the lunch whistle blew at noon, Mary picked up her shawl, her cardigan, and her lunch pail and headed out the door, where a rush of cold air greeted her. She struggled to pull her cardigan on. Her fingers throbbed with tiny cuts from the taut threads she had to tie, and her feet were so tired that every step was an effort. She slumped onto a wooden bench and rested her back against the rough bricks of the mill wall. Overhead, the thick black smoke belched into the air. Other workers talked and joked with each other, but Mary was too tired to join in. Once she had eaten her bread and suet, Mary went to find Mrs. Dugan, who was sitting in the midst of a group of older women, laughing raucously at a joke. Mary waited politely for Mrs. Dugan to notice her. Finally, the woman did. "Love, now, how did your first day go?" Mrs. Dugan asked kindly. Mary smiled. "Fine, thank you," she replied, glad her first day of work was over. "I suppose you'll be wanting Janet to show you where the classroom is. Just a minute, I'll call her." Without moving from where she was sitting, Mrs. Dugan yelled over the surrounding din, "Janet, get over here! I've got a new lass for you to meet." Mary watched as a tall, dark-haired girl walked over to them. Half an hour later, Mary was sitting in a chair, staring at a chalkboard. The room was long and narrow, and the lighting was so poor that Mary had to squint to see what the teacher was writing. The teacher was explaining the schedule for the week, which included reading, writing, arithmetic, singing, sewing, knitting, and geography. Mary's eyes sparkled as she listened. She could stand working half days in the hot, sweaty mill as long as she got to go to school for the other half of the day. If she walked home exhausted every evening, it didn't matter. She was learning to read and write, and that made everything worth it.